At this point, it seems that Putin's regime is indestructible. The economy is holding up to trade sanctions much better than many expected. Although, as we told you in our Patreon bulletin, things have started to change with the arrival of 2023. Be that as it may, Putin has been able to quell all protests, nor does an internal rebellion in the Kremlin's inner circle appear to be imminent. However, what if the problem was outside Moscow? In other words, to what extent could the country's peripheral regions seek to break away from Mother Russia someday? Is this really possible? It may surprise you, but this is one of Putin's own greatest fears. Listen up.
Кассировать бывший Советский Союз и его основную часть, Российскую Федерацию. Не знаю даже, сможет ли сохраниться такой этнос, как русский народ, в том виде, в котором есть сегодня.
In other words, the possible Balkanization of Russia is not something we made up here on VisualPolitik. It is a fear that Putin himself has. And the truth is that there are good reasons to think that Russia might break up someday. Remember that we're talking about an absolutely huge country with a lot of ethnicities and nationalities that are completely unlike the Russians in Moscow. And no, we're not only talking about territories like Chechnya. For example, did you know that the Republic of Tatarstan, which is the region you see here, was on the verge of becoming an independent and sovereign state? And we don't have to go back very far in time either. We're talking about 1992. This is just one example. Administratively, Russia is made up of 84 different territorial entities, and that's not counting what they have annexed from Ukraine. What's more, the differences between these entities are vast. For example, on the economic level, Russia is terribly unequal, much more so than even the European Union and all its constant expansions. For example, the GDP per capita of the richest region of the country can be, depending on the price of oil, up to 60 times higher than that of the poorest territory. This difference in the European Union is only 16 times. And the war in Ukraine is serving to increase these differences even more. At this point, I know what many of you will think. Good news for the West, right? Well, not so fast. An internal rift in Russia could trigger an international crisis of gigantic proportions. Think of it this way: who would get to keep Russia's nuclear arsenal? As you can see, we are talking about a scenario that, whether more or less likely, needs us to be prepared. So in today's video, we're going to focus on one of the most central aspects of Russian politics, and at the same time, the most unknown outside Russia. Could Russia really disintegrate territorially? Could they lose territories? What territories would these be, and why would they want to break away? Today we're going to answer these questions, but first, let's look at a bit of history.
The changing borders of Russia.
If you study the history of Russia, you will see that there are two ironclad rules that have been fulfilled for centuries. The first is that Russia always tends to expand. Yes, it is true that many other countries have territorial disputes, but the case of Russia is special. For example, what you see here is the Republic of Tuva, with a territory equivalent to 3 Costa Ricas. For most of its history, this area has been controlled by China. However, since 1944, it has been Russian territory. But pay attention. We're not only saying that it became territory of the Soviet Union. No, we're talking about the territory of Russia itself. But wait, there is more. The other place that you see is the island of Sakhalin, which is as big as the whole of Austria. For centuries, it was ruled by China, Japan, or Russia. In 1905, the Russians gave it to the Japanese. But after World War II, they took it back in its entirety. And we could go on with so many other territories: Primorsky, Karelia, Kaliningrad. But Russia's expansion did not end with the Second World War. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and last year in 2022, they annexed, at least on paper, the Donbass republics. And yes, we're talking about annexations. That is, on Russian world maps, both Crimea and Donbass are marked as territories that are Russian as St. Petersburg itself. In other words, Russia continues to move its borders even today, regardless of the international agreements they have signed. The second constant in Russian history is the inability of the Kremlin to send adequate resources and public services to all parts of its territory. Whether we're talking about the Russia of the Tsars, Soviet Russia, or Putin's Russia, Moscow always tries to control the whole country from the Kremlin, with disastrous results. This causes a lot of regional and ethnic tension. And this brings us to the third constant in Russian history, the tension between centralism and federalism. That is, depending on the historic point in time, Moscow has tried to give more autonomy to its regions and then has it taken away. So now the question is, if Russia can gain territories, could it also lose them? Well, right now, we're going to take a look.
Independent republics within Russia?
If you are interested in Russian politics, here is something that will catch your attention. Chechnya, Dagestan, Sakha. These are all regions of Russia, but they call themselves independent republics. What does this mean? Are they independent or are they part of Russia? How could you be independent and, at the same time, part of a country? Well, this is where this gentleman you see on the screen comes in. We're talking about Joseph Stalin. Yes, the same Stalin of the gulags and the deportations. When the communists came to power, they realized that there are two Russias, the central part and the periphery, which has very different ethnicities. For centuries, the Tsars had been expanding their territory, sometimes at the rate of one new Belgium a year. As a result, there were lots of regions whose only relationship with Moscow was the tribute they had to pay, and the young men they had to send to the wars. Otherwise, they had a different culture, religion, and even language. And don't think that we're talking about small territories. For example, this one here is the Republic of Saja. It is the size of India, making it the largest region in all of Russia. And it is populated by the Yakuts, who don't even speak a Slavic language. And this one that you see here is the Republic of Buryatia. It is as big as Germany, and it also has its own language, related to Mongolian. Well, Stalin realized that the best way to fit all these territories into his new communist utopia was to give them a special status, to allow these regions to keep their own language, their own culture, and their own traditions. Of course, religion was a separate issue because they were communists, but that's another story. And that's how the autonomous republics of Russia were born. That is to say, regions within Russia that were able to have their own constitution, maintain their language and culture. But be careful here. Don't confuse the autonomous republics with the Soviet socialist republics. For instance, Ukraine and Kazakhstan were part of the USSR, but were not part of Russia. However, the Sakha Republic we were talking about before, for example, was part of Russia. In other words, ironclad law number 3. The Kremlin cannot manage all its territories and is looking for a new fit, but the goodwill lasts only a decade. Basically, in 1938, Stalin himself reimposed Russian as a compulsory language, and deportations and cultural marginalization began. However, the concept of the autonomous republics was maintained, and this was very important. Why? Well, pay close attention.
When Russia almost broke apart.
Soviet Union, 1990s. The whole country is on the verge of collapse. The outcome? Russian territories that want to break away from the yoke of Moscow. To avoid a total collapse, the then Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, passed the Law on Autonomous Republics. On 26th of April 1990, the USSR gave the same legal status to the Russian republics as to the Soviet republics. In other words, Chechnya, for example, could have broken with Russia, but could have remained part of the Soviet Union, with the same status as Ukraine or Kazakhstan. So what was the problem with this law? Well, basically, that months later, Gorbachev himself ended up announcing the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, the Baltics, all these Soviet territories became new, independent countries. But what happened inside Russia? Well, in many of these autonomous republics, they asked themselves, are we still part of Russia or not? If the Ukrainians have become independent, why not the Chechens or the Tatars? Conclusion, in each of these republics, they held referendums to see if they wanted to remain with Russia or not. And what do you think happened? Well, there were republics that voted to become independent. You already know the story of Chechnya, but they were not the only ones. For example, there is the case of Tatarstan. The Tatars are a very different ethnic group from the Russians. They are Muslim, speak the Tatar language, which is also a Turkic language, and have their own history and even their own names. Well, in 1992, the Tatars voted in a self-determination referendum, 82% turnout, and 61% in favor of sovereignty, which the majority interpreted as independence. As you can imagine, this set off alarm bells in the Kremlin. Another Chechnya? Another region that wants to secede? Another region where we will have to send the army? Well, luckily, in this case, Yeltsin managed to convince them to stay. How? With good-naturedness and negotiation. During the 1990s, the Kremlin negotiated bilateral treaties with each and every one of these autonomous republics. That explains why each republic has had more or less autonomy depending on how they negotiated with Yeltsin. In the case of Tatarstan, since they wanted to leave, Moscow had no choice but to give them more autonomy than any of the other regions. This explains why, for more than 2 decades, the Tatars have been able to have their own taxes and even their own foreign policy. It turns out that the independent Republic of Tatarstan has better infrastructure and is more industrialized than its neighbors. In other words, it seemed that Yeltsin had found the solution for integrating all ethnic Russians into one federation. Okay, yes, we're talking about an unequal federalism, but it worked. The problem? Remember Russia's third ironclad law to seek a new fit for all the territories? Well, the goodwill only lasted until until a new tenant arrived in the Kremlin. Listen up.
Putin and the return to centralism.
Let me ask you a question. What is the name of Vladimir Putin's political party? Exactly. United Russia. Believe me, the name is no accident. If there is one thing Putin doesn't like, it's do-gooder federalism. In 2004, Putin eliminated the democratic election of regional governors. True, in 2013 he reinstated it, but with a lot of amendments. Put another way, regional leaders are chosen, in one way or another, by Moscow. To give you an idea, between 2012 and 2018, the Kremlin replaced 63 governors. And yes, that includes the very independent and very sovereign Tatarstan. Since 2017, they have even lost the ability to collect their own taxes. In other words, as of today, we can already say that Russia is once again a federal republic in name only. All decisions are made from Moscow, and this is noticeable above all regarding money. To give you an idea, between 2012 and 2018, the Kremlin's tax revenues, measured in rubles, not dollars, grew by 77%, while those of the regions by only 3%. So what does this mean? Rule number 3, we give you independence to make you stay, and a few years later, we take it away. And I know what many of you will be thinking. It makes sense. A country with so many territorial inequalities needs redistribution of resources. For example, 80% of Chechnya's resources come from the Kremlin. But this centralism has very big economic problems, and the war in Ukraine doesn't help. Why? We're going to take a look at that right now.
Don't bite off more than you can chew.
As of today, in the year 2023, it is estimated that 20% of the Russian population has no access to running water. For example, in many areas of the Sakha Republic, where it can reach -40 degrees in winter, they have to buy blocks of ice every day and heat them in order to have clean water. This may explain why half of Russia is uninhabited. To give you an idea, the Far Eastern District accounts for 41% of the Russian territory, but only 5.5% of the population. Of course, the climate is not in Russia's favor, but it is not only a problem of climate, but also of resource management. And here I will digress a little. Russia's problems with the Far East is enough for a video in itself, and it has a lot to do with Putin's strategy of pivoting towards Asia. But this is a subject that is well worth dwelling on and paying close attention to the details. And for that reason, instead of publishing it openly, we are going to reserve it for those of you who follow us on our Patreon community. You already know that you can support VisualPolitik through Patreon. From there, you have a range of options that will allow you to receive up to 2 exclusive weekly publications. The weekly Snapshot and Latam Politik. In addition, there is an exclusive content option where we deal with more in-depth topics for all those of you who are passionate about international politics. So as we said, in our Patreon, you will be able to see a much more in-depth analysis of Putin's problems in developing the Asian part of Russia. But for now, let's move on with this video. Moscow has a problem of galactic proportions when it comes to bringing infrastructure to the whole country. For example, something that will surprise you. Russia has hardly any bridges, while the United States has about 600,000 bridges. Russia, which is 1.7 times larger, has about 42,000 bridges. That translates into areas the size of all of Western Europe, where it is almost impossible to find jobs. But why can't they build infrastructure? Well, let's look at one example. The bridge in Yakutsk, the capital of the Republic of Sakha. This project came to a screeching halt in 2014. Why? Well, because that was the year in which Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula. Suddenly, the Kremlin's priority became the development of its new territory, Crimea. Almost all the money went to projects like the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea with the rest of Russia. That and the pharaonic projects like the Sochi Winter Olympics, one of the most expensive in history. In this project alone, the Kremlin blew more than $16 billion, almost double the $9 billion they had planned to invest in developing the Far East District. Do you understand where I'm going now? Now the Kremlin has almost unlimited power to manage Russia's entire budget, and now Putin has other priorities that take precedence over developing all the far-flung regions. On the one hand, he needs to increase military spending. On the other hand, he needs to keep the accounts under control. Many regions are being marginalized. In fact, it is estimated that by 2024, 68% of the GDP of all Russia will come from the 12 most prosperous regions alone. But we're not just talking about money, we're also talking about lives. Where do you think most of the Ukrainian war casualties are coming from? Well, take a look at this approximation, which is probably an understatement, but it gives us an idea of how things are. At the time of making this video, Moscow has lost 98 soldiers. If we take into account that Moscow has 13 million inhabitants, we could say that most Moscow families sleep pretty peacefully. What about other regions like the Republic of Buryatia? In this case, we're talking about 452 fallen. That is, at least 1 out of 2,000 inhabitants has died in the war. In other places like the Republic of Tuva, we find similar figures. In other words, there are more and more people in these regions who personally know people killed in this war, a war that is taking place thousands of kilometers away. Keep in mind that the distance between the Republic of Tuva and Ukraine is the same as the distance between Spain and Armenia. And all this explains why self-determination movements are beginning to emerge. In fact, in 2022, the Forum of Free Nations of Russia was born, in which several separatist movements are beginning to organize themselves. So, nobody knows. Are we really going to see a separatist movement in Russia? It's too early to say. And if so, it could be many years away. As we always say, here on VisualPolitik, we cannot predict the future. But we can say that the problems of the Tsarist Russia persist in Putin's Russia. And just as Russia has struggled with ethnic tension in the past, it could be doing so again in the not-so-distant future. In any case, there are a lot of issues that we have had to leave out. If you want to know more about this topic, we are waiting for you in our Patreon. In the meantime, the questions are over to you. Will we see a new wave of separatist movements? Will Russia be able to find another new solution for all these republics? If not, what would happen to the whole Russian nuclear arsenal? In whose hands would it be left? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you liked the video, I guess you did because you're still here, please like it. I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you very soon.